All right, so I'm live. Hey everyone. I am going to talk to you today a little bit about literary criticism. In the Blackboard Shell, you should have seen the readings with the links to the Purdue OWL lessons on literary criticism. It's just a couple paragraphs each. I want you to read through those. If you haven't already, you can pause this video, go do that, and then come back. Okay, and we're going to talk about each of the different critical theories that are in those links. But before we do that, I want to explain to you what critical theory is. So critical theory is just think of it as a lens through which to look at a specific literary text. So, for example, you've got a couple of options on that list. You've got Marxist criticism, psychoanalytic criticism, feminist criticism, gender studies and queer theory criticism, and critical race theory. So if you look through those different lenses, the story that you're reading might take on a different meaning based on the lens that you're looking through. So let's talk a little bit about each of the theories, and then I'm going to give you some examples and show you how looking at a story through a different lens can affect your reading of the story. So the first one that we're looking at is Marxist criticism. I'm going to post a link to the biography of Karl Marx. If you haven't watched that yet, you should go do that. So pause me again and go watch the biography and then come back. It's just a couple of minutes, 3 or 4 minutes. So Karl Marx was most famous for writing the Communist Manifesto. And Karl Marx was a strong critic of capitalistic systems. He believed that there was too big of a disparity between what he referred to as the bourgeoisie, the upper class, and the proletariat, who were the working class. If any of you have ever used the word bougie or heard anybody say the word bougie, that's where it comes from, bourgeoisie. So a text that you use to the Marxist criticism, if you look through the lens of Marxist criticism at a specific text, you're looking for things like class struggles, financial differences, big differences in wealth, and in social status based on money. Okay, so that's a Marxist criticism. The next one we're looking at is psychoanalytic criticism, and I picked these two to go first because they're both based on the theories of a specific person. So psychoanalytic criticism is based on the theories of Sigmund Freud. So again, pause now, go check out the video of Sigmund Freud that I posted, and also check out the video entitled Id, Ego, and Superego. Okay, those are Freud's most well-known concepts, and Freud believed that we are guided largely by our subconscious, and that is your id. And your id is fully subconscious. It pursues pleasure only. Avoidance of pain, pursuit of pleasure, and that's it. That's all your id does. The superego's job is to act as the conscience and sort of keep the id in check, but the superego is also subconscious, and it can cause feelings of guilt, strong feelings of guilt, if it feels like your id is taking too much control. And then your ego is the conscious you, right? So that's how you balance these two different parts of your personality consciously and aware. I apologize, my kids are running around in the hallway. So if you're looking at a story through a psychoanalytic lens, you are looking at it through these ideas of Freud. So you're looking for things like the id, the ego, the superego. An Oedipus complex is something that shows up in psychoanalytic theory and in Freud's writing. The other thing that you might be looking for are different neuroses or different defense mechanisms. These are all words that Freud uses in his own writings. And then if you are applying literary theory through psychoanalytic criticism to your writings, you would be looking for those same things. And you would talk about how your characters exhibit these different things and why they might do that. The next one that we're going to talk about is feminist theory. Feminist theory looks at the different ways that women are oppressed. Okay, and it could be it could be social, it could be economic, it could be political, but it is focusing on the oppression of women. It came about in around the 1960s when the feminist movement started to really make progress, and it's still around today. People still look through the lens of feminist criticism. We're going to look through some of that in one of our next readings at the yellow wallpaper. The next one we're going to talk about is gender studies and queer theory. And gender studies talks about the notions of what it is to be defined as a gender as a whole. So it might incorporate some feminist theory. It might have a lot in common with feminist theory, but it looks at the ways that different groups have been oppressed in gender-based language. Okay, so it might talk about things like having a binary and why people felt the need for a binary, and maybe the movement now towards is not having the binary gendered language. I'm just going to. So I'm going to read you a quote here because it's a little bit easier to understand it. Gender studies and queer theory came out around the 1970s, shortly after feminist criticism, and right around the same time as critical race theory. And it explores issues of sexuality, power, and marginalized populations. So the marginalized populations here might be women, but it also might be other marginalized populations. A primary concern in gender studies and queer theory is the manner in which gender and sexuality is discussed, and then the power relations and the power dynamics that go along with both of those things. Critical race theory is, again, the 1970s to the present, and it examines the appearance of race and racism across dominant cultural modes of expression. So how are members of different races presented? Does that align with the presentation of the day? Does that align with our presentation today? Have we made more progress as compared to the way that races might be presented in different literary works? Critical race theory scholars attempt to understand how victims of systemic racism are affected by cultural perceptions of race and how they are able to represent themselves to counter prejudice. So these are all just, these definitions are coming straight out of the Purdue OWL that you read. The links that are in that Blackboard video, or I'm sorry, in that Blackboard shell right before the video. The video that is presented there also talks about these different areas, and we'll go into a little more detail to explain it. I'm just sort of giving you the summary version of what each of these mean. But I want to really focus this video on showing you some specific examples. And hopefully these are examples that some of you are familiar with. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but I am going to sum it up to you. So one of the ones I want to talk about is this, The Sneetches by Dr. Seuss. For those of you, I'm going to post links to The Sneetches so you can take a minute and go read it. I'm not going to read it to you because it is somewhat of a longish story. But basically, there are two kinds of Sneetches at the outset of the story. One kind of Sneetches has stars on their belly. The other kind of Sneetch does not have stars on their belly. And the star-bellied Sneetches are much more socially present and much more, they're higher on the social ladder than the plain belly Sneetches. It's much better to be a star belly Sneetch. And everything is moving along fine that way. These star-bellied Sneetches are clearly superior in their own minds, and they treat the plain belly Sneetches badly. And that's just the status quo and the way it is until this gentleman comes into town and he tells the plain belly Sneetches that he has a machine that can add stars to their bellies. And so they all get stars on their bellies. And now nobody can tell who the superior class of Sneetches is. And it goes back and forth, back and forth. The man decides that he now needs to make a star off machine. So he takes the stars off and then he makes the machine to put them back on. And all day long, the Sneetches run through this machine until they finally can't remember who had the stars to begin with and who didn't. And the man drives away laughing at how silly Sneetches are, and his pockets full of their money. But we do find out at the end that the Sneetches come to realize, of course, because it's a children's book, that it doesn't matter who has stars on their bellies, everybody's the same. So the Sneetches could be looked at in two different ways. You could look at the Sneetches through the lens of critical race theory. There are two different races of Sneetches here. There are the Sneetches with the stars and the Sneetches without the stars. And there is definitely superiority and differences between those two. Because this is an ideal story, it works out in the end where everything becomes equal. And all this, the two different races of Sneetch are finally equal. You could also look at this through a Marxist lens, because the gentleman who comes through who has the machine, he is manipulating, he's creating a demand for his product, right? He puts all the stars on the bellies of the Sneetches, and now he knows the ones who had them to begin with want them off. So he creates a machine. He creates that demand, and then he creates a machine to satisfy that demand. And he does this. He creates the demand and then creates the solution to the demand until he's rich, and then he leaves. It's a very capitalist way of doing things, and he is the villain in this story. And Marxist critical theory does not take a high view of capitalism. And so, so you could look at this through a capitalist lens. Okay. Another one that I want to talk about is, and I will put the link to, Yertle the Turtle. Now, this is my big Seuss book, but I'm going to show you a couple of pictures. And once I find Yertle the Turtle. Okay, so Yertle is the king. He's the guy, that guy right there in that swamp. And Yertle decides that he can only be king of what he can see, and because he's down low, he can't see enough, so he needs to get higher. And the way that he gets higher is that he starts to climb on the back of his subjects. And he can see a little bit more and a little bit more until he gets very, very, very high up. And he says, I'm king of all that I see. And he's on the backs of all these turtles. And the little, that guy down there at the bottom says, but sir, he says, beg your pardon, King Yertle. I have pains in my back and my shoulders and knees. How long must we stand here, your majesty? Please. And Yertle yells, right? He's being the evil king. And so he just keeps going up and up and up, and he cuts more turtles and more turtles, and until he's this high. And then again, down at the bottom, little Mort says, hey, we turtles can't stand it. Our shells will all crack. Besides, we need food. We are starving. But down at the bottom, we too should have rights. Okay, so at the bottom, you've got the people who are uplifting the king, who are saying, hey, we need rights too. And Yertle at the top says, you be quiet. But then the Mac, not Mort. Mac at the bottom does a tiny little thing, and he burps. And his burp shakes the whole tower of turtles. And because it's so high, Yertle falls to the bottom, lands in the pond, and becomes king of the mud. Okay? And that is the end of Yertle the turtle. So again, now I was looking at Yertle the turtle in one light. I was looking at it through a Marxist lens again, that we clearly have this power structure, right? Where or a class system where Yertle is at the top, and he's using all of these proletariat turtles, these like lower level turtles, to build him up to the top. And only when the lower turtles take charge, which is what Marx pushed, he wanted the proletariat to band together and all workers unite. That was his favorite line, or his famous line. Only when they all do that does the king collapse, right? So you can look at this through a Marxist lens. I did have a student today who talked about looking at this. Now, the students had a critical race theory lens, and that is because here in the United States, when we think of slavery and enslavement, it usually does we're usually thinking about the slavery that happened, back in the day, and it was a race issue back then. And still in many places it still is. In this particular case, because they're all the same, they're all turtles, there isn't a necessarily different race that is there, but the idea of enslavement does exist. And so you could look at it through that way as well. Lastly, we're going to talk about feminist theory, okay? And the most clear example to me, as I was I was obviously scanning my kids' bookshelves to find these examples for you. And the one that jumped out at me was this one. You all are probably familiar with this story, The Little Mermaid. So Ariel is a mermaid, and she lives in the ocean. And of course, she meets the man. And when she meets the man, she decides that the only way for her to be happy is to marry the man. And in order to do that, she must change very fundamental things about herself. So Ariel becomes a different person, literally in her body, becomes a different person to be able to win the man, which is the ultimate goal. Many Disney movies are like this. There is the handsome prince that sweeps in, and he is the only one that is able to save the woman. That is a very common trope in a lot of princess stories back in the day. And actually, I think the actual fairy tale of The Little Mermaid is a little darker than that. I believe she dies at the end and she gets washed up on shore. But it's been a long time since I read it. So that is definitely a feminist interpretation of the movie The Little Mermaid. And this is the last example. I'm not going to read the whole Go Dog Go to you, because I think Go Dog Go has no plot that I can tell. A bunch of dogs ride to a tree on various automobiles and bicycles and vehicles, and they get to the tree and they go to the top of the tree and they have a party. And that's sort of the entire plot of Go Dog Go. So I'm not going to read it to you, but there is one moment, or repeated moments, that I am going to point out to you. We've got this dog right here. This scene right here, if you've read this book, you're very familiar with this scene that happens over and over. We get the female dog here that says to the male dog, do you like my hat? And the male dog says, I do not, which is a little rude, in my opinion. And so she says goodbye and goodbye. And then again, he says, they run into each other again. Hello again. Hello. Her hat's a little more fancy now. She says, do you like my hat? He says, I do not like it. Then we have another time. Now she's got even bigger, fancier hat. Hello again. Hello. Do you like my hat? I do not like that hat. Goodbye. Goodbye. So no matter how hard she tries, she just cannot win the approval of this dog until she gets to the end, which I've lost my post-it note. And she says, finally, hello again. And now do you like my hat? And he says, I do. What a hat. I like it. And look at that ridiculous hat that she is now wearing. So if we were looking at that through a feminist lens, we would say that she is trying to win the approval of a male by increasing her, changing her appearance, and by continually trying to make herself look and dress the way that she thinks he would like her to. And so that would be a feminist interpretation of this book. Okay. If we were to look at this through a gender studies lens, we might question why I assumed that was a female dog to begin with, because just because the dog is red and wears a fancy hat does not mean the dog is female. Okay. And that is a discussion of how gender is a construct and a chosen construct rather than a biological construct. So that might be something that you would discuss if you're looking through it as a gender studies lens. Okay. So I hope that clears up some of these literary criticism theories for you. I'm going to post a related discussion in the discussion board. So please go to the discussion board and find the follow-up post and answer that through this week at some point. I'm going to update your task list to include that. And I think after that, you all will be reading the yellow wallpaper. I will post another video where we talk about the yellow wallpaper. But what I want you to think about as you're reading the yellow wallpaper is, what critical lens do you think makes sense for you to read that story through? And oftentimes you might have a lens that you prefer. I read a lot of things with a feminist lens, and with the gender studies lens. It is one that interests me, and so it is a way that I analyze a lot of texts. You might find something different. And of course, there are many texts that lend themselves more to a critical race theory lens, especially in contemporary times. That is a lens a lot of people are using, and that's good too. So whatever works for you, whatever one that you feel like speaks to you the most, is a good one to look for. And the beauty part is that you can take one text and you can analyze it in several different ways, and you're not wrong any of those different ways, as long as you have information from the text and evidence to back it up. That all said, I hope you have a great week, and I look forward to seeing some of you during my office hours, completely optional, tomorrow night, 7:30 to 8:30. The link is in our Blackboard. Bye, everyone.